So our passage today, we're going to have two of them, so we're going to be diving into the scriptures a lot today. So be ready. But our verse or our little section of the prayer is, where there is injury, let us sow pardon. So I think April and Ren were pretty sneaky about giving me this one, but that's all right. We'll dive in and figure out what this means. We start with our first passage, which comes from the second book of Samuel, chapter 12. Here are these words from the scriptures. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. So this is the story after David has taken Bathsheba, another man's wife, and then contrived a way to kill Uriah. So this has all happened preceding this passage. Nathan came to David and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are this man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all of Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. In our passage this morning, the prophet Nathan comes to David after David has abused his power and orchestrated the death of a man in order to marry the man's wife. God had granted King David the whole of Israel, and yet it still was not enough for him. And he took what did not belong to him, abusing his power and his right as the king. David's action was that of an injury against Uriah, Bathsheba, the Lord, the people, and even himself. So Nathan holds up a mirror to David in order that David might do some soul searching. And out of this comes the famous passage of Psalm 51. This is David's opportunity to be contrite, to begin to sow pardon, to begin to live in to the reality that he has sinned against God and his people, and now he needs to own his mistakes. So hear these words from Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions and my sin is ever before me. Against you and you alone have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified in your sentence and blameless when you pass judgment. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. You desire truth in the inward being. Therefore, teach me wisdom in my secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all of my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me in a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from bloodshed, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your deliverance. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. Do good in Zion, in your good pleasure. Rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices and burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This psalm is a psalm of confession, a psalm where David recognizes his mistakes and must come to terms with his action. He recognizes the injury that he has against God, his people, Bathsheba, and even his own relationships. So he must come before God seeking pardon after he recognizes his sin. But sin is one of those three-letter words that we don't like to talk about anymore. We kind of dance around the word sin, and we say our mistakes, our failures, our mess-ups. But I think that it's really important for us to understand, though, that sin, the word sin, is really just anything that separates us from God, from one another, and even from our own hearts. Sin is the injury that we cause against others, and it is the result of the injuries committed against us. So it is fitting that St. Francis uses this phrase, where there is injury, so pardon. How can one be an instrument of peace if there is injury or hurt or discord? How can there be peace if we sin against God and one another? David was considered a righteous man before God, and yet even his own heart betrayed him. His own heart was filled with selfishness and greed and lust and desire. And the prophet Nathan was sent to him to remind him that you may be anointed as my king to serve over Israel, but you are by no means perfect. We as a people cannot deny that evil lives inside human hearts. And we are often a people who lean towards those things that would injure another. Our desire for more wealth or more things injures our planet, straining our resources, maybe straining people who have no choices. Our desire for cheap things out of other countries often puts people at risk, young children, in labor camps. In our pride and in our selfishness, in our wandering hearts, we are a people who are prone to injure one another and even sometimes ourselves. We are a people who can do great things and commit great evil. So when we are challenged to forgive or pardon the injuries of the world, we wonder, what does this look like? As a person of faith, we believe in forgiveness. So are we to believe that we forgive all manners of crimes and sins, big or small, and to do it instantly? Is this what St. Francis is telling us? Yes, we have an imperfect world. Crime abounds. Little white lies aren't just little white lies. The injury can be big or small. So how are we, as the people of God, to live as instruments of peace when injury abounds and when we cause injury? I think this statement and this part of the prayer invites us to begin to examine our own hearts, our own thoughts, and our own actions. St. Francis understood the human condition, that we are a people that are not without pride, not without sin, not without selfishness, that we do intentionally and unintentionally harm one another. We hurt people by our actions, our thoughts, our words, by the things we do, and even the things that we don't do. King David's story of Bathsheba and Uriah is one that we know well. He was tempted by another man's wife, took her against her will, then had her husband killed. His injury seems pretty egregious. It's pretty far-fetching. And we may think to ourselves, well, my sin isn't that bad, right? Like, how many of us have done that? I don't think we would ever admit to it if we did, anyways. But Nathan exposed David to the injury that he had caused all around him. Because by exposing David to this injury that he had caused, it was a way for the healing to begin. How many of you ever scraped a knee? Okay, every hand should be in the air. Because if you were a child, you scraped something, right? So when we think of an injury like a skinned knee or an elbow or a, busted face or whatever, we have to begin to think of it in terms of healing and wholeness. We clean the wound, we dress the wound, and we allow the wound to begin to heal. See, injury implies the possibility of healing, reconciliation, and wholeness. Healing is at the forefront of this question. It's not just about right or wrong, or good or bad, or evil or good, but really when we use the word injury in this statement that St. Francis has given us, it implies that there might be something to come out of it in our sowing of pardon that might bring healing and reconciliation and wholeness. Is there a possibility of healing and reconciliation? So sowing pardon in this statement is really this idea of act of healing and reconciliation. It's an attempt to bring wholeness and completeness. But let me be very clear. It's not meaning that we approve or accept or have blind forgiveness for someone's sins or wrongdoing. It doesn't mean that we just walk around saying, you hurt me. Oh, that's okay, you're forgiven, right? Sowing pardon doesn't mean that we just offer cheap grace and we pardon every sin and we don't hold people accountable for their injury in being when they've done something. Pardon is not just about, blanket forgiveness. Pardon is doing what is necessary to restore health and wholeness to the body, spirit, and our relationships. Sowing pardon then requires a process. That injury of an injured knee or arm, it doesn't happen overnight. It requires a process of healing. And so too then, when we're talking about sowing pardon, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen overnight. And sowing pardon doesn't mean that we have to become best friends with the person who's injured us. Sowing pardon is when such incomprehensible events occur, or when an injury has been done to us or we have done to others. Our goal should be to promote healing in any manner of which we are capable of. Let me say that again. To promote healing in any manner of which we are capable of. The process of sowing pardon allows us to be freeing of ourselves from the burden of the injury that has been caused to us, or by seeking pardon, we can lessen the burden of the injury on another. So when David prays this prayer in Psalm 51, it is his way to seek pardon for his behavior, that he might be restored back to relationship with God. And he cries out, Lord, have mercy on me. Wash away my sin. Cleanse me. Create in me a clean heart, O God. And when you do this, I will teach others, and they will come back to you as well. What I like in this is the word sowing. Not sowing as in knitting, but sowing as in planting. Sowing does not imply that something is fully grown or complete, only that the seeds of possibility have been planted. But we are often a stubborn people, and we often cause injury to another. And sometimes in our causing injury, we may be embarrassed or afraid of what the other's response might be when we seek forgiveness. So we stay stuck, separated, or alienated from one another. But yet, if we go back to that word sowing, sowing implies simply trying to repair the harm that has been done. It also implies that when harm has been done to us, we begin to sow forgiveness in our own hearts and in our own prayers. And maybe it's sometimes just, God, help me to stand being around that person. God, help me to begin to figure out how to forgive them. God, help me in my anger. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes, even if forgiveness does not seem possible, just the act of sowing may be all that we need to begin to learn how to be people of pardon. To be an instrument of peace, we can't carry anger and hatred and unforgiveness continually. Does it mean that we have to love everyone perfectly all the time? No. Does it mean that we have to be the person who is Zen-like and peace-like all the time and never get angry or raise our voice? That's not a reality. But does it mean that to be an instrument of peace, we do have to seek to sow grace and forgiveness in healing? Yes, it does. Again, forgiveness does not mean that we have to be a people who accept everything willy-nilly. It is a process, and it may be difficult, but God is with us. This past week, and here's kind of I think a concrete example of this. I want to kind of end us on. This past week, I was on a Zoom conference call. Hopefully, fingers crossed, I've been trying to go to Israel for a study leave for 3 years now, and it's been canceled 4 times. So praying that in November, I will be in Israel to learn about the conflict and occupation of Israel-Palestine. So in preparation for that, we are doing these pre-conference study calls in Zoom. And we were listening to this story from a man who I will not use his name for protection of his protection. But this gentleman is one of the co-founders of an organization where they bring Palestinians and Jews, Palestinian Jewish parents together who have all lost a child to the ongoing conflict and occupation in Israel. And his story began in 1997 when he lost his 14-year-old daughter to a suicide bomber in the city of Jerusalem. There were 5 children killed that day, 3 of which were little girls, one of whom was his daughter. He shared about how angry he was. For an entire year, he said, all I wanted was revenge, retaliation, and I wanted to make the Palestinians pay for his child's death. Then, after about a year of being angry, he began to see how his own hurt, his own injury, was stealing life from him, his wife, and his other 3 children. So he began to go on this journey of reflection, asking the question, will my retaliation bring my daughter back? Will revenge help bring peace and prevent this from happening to others? Will my anger keep me from living my life fully with my remaining 3 children? What can be done, he said. He was searching for peace. He then met another individual who invited him to come and sit in dialogue with other parents who had lost children due to the occupation and conflict. So he went to this location and he watched as a Palestinian woman got off the bus holding a picture of her dead 6-year-old daughter who had been killed by an Israeli soldier. And he said he was embarrassed to admit that in that exact moment, at the age of 47, He had never met a Palestinian before. And he'd never seen a Palestinian as being a human being. For the first time, he experienced the reality and saw the pain in his enemy that he had suffered. And he realized that the violence in Israel would not stop until people started talking, until people sat down with each other and saw each other as human beings, until people begin, and these are my words, to become instruments of peace, sowing pardon instead of revenge, victimhood, and retaliation. That is what St. Francis is trying to help us understand. Where there is injury, let me sow pardon. And this gentleman is not, he's culturally a Jew, and by birth a Jew, but he's not practicing Jew. So he will tell you he's not a religious person. But out of his pain and suffering, and out of that process of sowing forgiveness and pardon, he and this other gentleman created this institution or this organization that seeks to bring Palestinians and Jewish families together to recognize the pain and suffering that they're causing each other. He said, until we see each other as human beings and we sit next to each other, we cannot sow peace. This is not easy, and he will rightfully admit it is not a process that can be done overnight. This, my friends, is what St. Francis wants of us. We all commit acts that hurt others. We all need to ask for forgiveness, and we also all need to learn to forgive. We hold too tightly to that injury that's been done to us. It is like an infected wound, right? If we didn't clean that bandaged wound or that knee, it would continue to fester and get worse. And other things might be caused out of that. And I think that's what St. Francis is trying to encourage us to understand. When we hold on to the frustration and the anger and the hurt and the betrayal and whatever word you want to fill into that, we allow the wound to fester and get worse. So the call for us then is to be a people who learn to both forgive and to be forgiven. To recognize that we all cause injury and need to seek forgiveness, but then also learn how to sow forgiveness. Our faith as a people of God should be our daily task, to find ways to forgive the errors of others, to find a way to forgive the errors in ourselves, not to diminish what's been done or to forgive unilaterally the wrongs that have been done to us, but take the baby steps one day at a time to sow the acts of forgiveness. May we then, the people of God, be instruments of peace as we sow pardon where possible to the world around us. Thanks be to God. Amen.